Welcome back to This Week in Immigration. I'm Jordan LaPier. On this week's program, new rules for foreign students, furloughs coming at USCIS, and the latest on walls, both physical and virtual. All that's just ahead. Stick around. And here with me today, as always, are Theresa Cardinal Brown, Director of Immigration and Cross-Border Policy. She's on Twitter at BPC_T Brown. Hey, Theresa.
Hi, Jordan.
And Cris Ramón, Senior Immigration Policy Analyst on Twitter at CRamonBPC. Hi, Cris.
Hey, good to see you.
Yeah, thanks to you both for being here. All right, so last week, the Trump administration announced new regulations that require foreign university students to enroll in in-person classes or a combination of in-person and online classes for the fall semester in order to maintain their legal status. Students taking only online classes would not be allowed to remain in the United States. That's a change from the spring and summer semesters when the government relaxed its rules, allowing foreign students to take more online courses while still maintaining their legal status. Theresa, what are these rules about online classes for foreign students, and how did ICE change those rules during the start of the pandemic this spring?
Sure. So for a very, very long time, the requirements for foreign students on F-1 visas to study in the United States stated very clearly that online-only curricula, that is, courses that are offered to a degree that are only offered online, do not qualify a foreign national to enter on a student visa. In order to come in on a student visa, they have to have a curricula that is in person. The regulations do allow foreign students to take up to one course a semester or 3 credits online, but the vast majority of their classes have to be in person. That's been the standard rule. Earlier this year in March, due to the coronavirus and seeing that many universities were transitioning and closing schools temporarily and moving to online instruction, ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, that runs the Student and Exchange Visitor Program, issued guidance that said that schools that were temporarily stopping in-person classes, implementing online or other learning, could still allow non-immigrant students to remain in the United States as long as they notified ICE within 10 days of these changes. That guidance was supposed to be in place temporarily, but for the duration of the current coronavirus emergency. And that was sent out to all of the participants in this Student Exchange Visitor Program. And so many foreign students just remained in the United States for the spring semester and into the end. However, just after the July 4th holiday, ICE issued new guidance rescinding that and saying that the new guidance says that completely online instruction would no longer allow foreign students to stay in the United States. So for colleges and universities that were looking to continue online-only instruction in the fall, foreign students on F-1 visas would not be allowed to stay in the United States to pursue those classes. They had to have some classes that were in person. They allowed for more than one class that the current regulations say, but it had to be some sort of hybrid, quote-unquote, curricula that allowed for some in person and some online, but the majority would have to be in person. That guidance came out after many universities and colleges had started announcing their fall plans, most notably Harvard and MIT, that they would be online only. So this came as a big blow to colleges and universities, and many foreign students who, caught off guard, would not be able to, for example, apply to and be accepted and enrolled for the fall in another school that is offering some in-person classes. Or in many cases, some of these students are not able to travel home. Maybe there's travel restrictions in their countries. Nor, if they went home, could they necessarily continue to take courses online, depending on the circumstances in their countries. Maybe they don't have full internet access. Maybe that internet access is blocked by their government. Maybe there's major time zone issues of participating in courses of study halfway around the world. So This has caused a lot of chaos and consternation in the university, higher education, and foreign student community.
Cris, what impact is this all going to have? As Theresa said, some schools like Harvard have already announced they're going to be all online in the fall, which seems to be a big hurdle for foreign students there. But others, like my alma mater, Arizona State, say they don't think their foreign students are going to be impacted by this rule.
So, I think broadly, as Theresa noted, that this will probably have, first and foremost, an impact on students who it will be difficult for them to be able to participate in online courses due to circumstances that they see in their countries. Like Theresa noted, this is time differences. That's one issue. Lack of reliable internet and computer services. Potential issues around censorship. So those are things that are going to be important to know, and especially if students are particularly coming back from a lower income bracket from their home countries, may not be able to have the same access to the same materials as their counterparts who might be, socioeconomically better off than they would be. But I think when you're looking at it here in the United States, there's a couple of things to consider. First and foremost, obviously this is going to impact universities. It's going to impact the capacity of universities to maintain programs that are maintained by large numbers of international students. So this may be, engineering programs that may be, for example, half might be international students. That could impact that. And it could also impact programs that intentionally serve international students, like orientation courses or language courses, and that could impact not only those programs, it could actually impact professors, and many of them who are adjunct professors. So this could have an impact on universities. And then, of course, there's the broader discussion about the economic fallout from this policy. Obviously, international students bring in a lot of purchasing power to the communities and the colleges that they're located in. They are able to sort of bring in not only to be able to serve like local businesses, but subsequently a lot of them may be able to work in the area through the optical practical training program that allows them to work in the United States for a set period of time. That can generate an additional revenue and additional economic benefits. So it's going to have a wide displacing effect, not only on the lives of the students that might be affected, but on the universities and the communities around these universities. So it could potentially be very, very problematic.
And I think because of the problematicness, I mean, we know that just this week, both Harvard and MIT have sued in federal district court in Boston over these regulations and are asking for an injunction against them. I imagine that other colleges and universities will either join that suit or file their own soon. So they are recognizing the impact to their students. Research programs that heavily rely on graduate students, many of whom are foreign students, could be impacted by this. So there's a lot of far-reaching implications here. The other thing I would just say is that the United States has for decades been the number one destination for international students around the world. And we have slowly but surely been losing that advantage. International student enrollment has been going down over the last 2 or 3 years. And after moves like this, it could crater. The administration has said that one of the reasons for this is that they want to encourage colleges and universities to open up in the fall, not to offer online classes, regardless of the health considerations for the schools, their students, their instructors, their staff. But putting foreign students in the crosshairs as a way of encouraging colleges and universities to open up is, I would say, not exactly the way that you'd want to try to make that case.
Okay, when we come back, furloughs coming to USCIS. U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, which handles immigration benefits for non-citizens, is facing a cash crunch. The agency is funded by user fees, and steep declines in incoming funds mean 70% of its workforce is now facing furloughs. Now, USCIS has asked Congress for an infusion of $1.2 billion to avoid that, but critics say the Trump administration's legal immigration policies have caused this, and want Congress to prohibit DHS from using the funds for enforcement. So, Theresa, how did we get here, and how might these furloughs affect the immigration system at large?
So the proximate story here that is in May, USCIS sent a letter to Congress noting that it expected a shortfall in fee revenue for this fiscal year of at least $1.2 billion. They noted that they saw a 50% decrease in fee receipts from incoming filings for petitions and applications for visas and employment authorization in March. They are attributing this to the COVID-19 virus. And they, as you noted, they are saying that without an emergency infusion of cash from Congress, they will have to lay off up to 13,000 of their 18,000 person workforce by August 3rd. And because of federal personnel rules, they sent notices to those workers right before the July 4th holiday, notifying them that as of August they may be furloughed. And so, this has been the debate. The administration says that this is necessary, that this is all due to COVID, and it was unforeseen. They are, as you mentioned, USCIS is a fee-funded agency. The way they work is they ask Congress to basically advance them by appropriation the amount of money they expect to receive in fee revenues for the fiscal year. So when they overestimate or underestimate, they would have to pay that money back to the Treasury if it's over or under appropriated. In this case, as they mentioned, they wildly overestimated the number of fees that would come in. And Congress is now saying that they're going to look at this. They did say for a while that they hadn't received actually a formal request from the White House for this. There's been some debate back and forth. But the reality here is that it's part of a bigger debate about USCIS funding. And as you mentioned, immigration advocates, Democrats are saying, hey, wait a minute. This can't just all be because of COVID. There's got to be more going on there. And if you take a deeper look at USCIS operations, it actually was facing budget problems long before the pandemic. So last fall, USCIS proposed significant fee increases that it argued should go into effect during this fiscal year, including as much as an 83% hike for naturalization applications, because it was already projecting some deficits. USCIS had in the last several years actually an excess of funds from fee revenues that they were allowed to carry over from year to year. But in the last 3 years, they managed to basically use up all of that excess. And they went from having a budget surplus, if you will, to a budget shortfall. So why is that? Well, again, there's several reasons that people are pointing to. One is that they have taken on additional duties and responsibilities. They have started doing more strict vetting and investigations for fraud. They are taking longer to do their adjudications. They're requiring in-person interviews, things that make adjudications take longer and are more resource intensive. But the other thing to bear in mind is that policies this administration has put in place have actually reduced the number of filings. So, for example, when they terminated the DACA program, that terminated the applications and fees that would go along with that. Now, the courts have extended that program, but only for renewals. No new applicants could file. So the expected number of incoming applications went down. The administration terminated TPS for about 300,000 people in the United States. All of those annual 18-month TPS filings went away. And so they were not able to do that. There's been significant declines in family-based petitions for immediate relatives and other relatives. Many people ascribe that to the new public charge regulations, which could have an disproportionate impact on those kind of relative filings. So that has all driven down receipts as much as 60 to 70% in the course of 2 years. So it's not fair to say this is all COVID related. There are a lot of other things that this administration has done to drive down the filings, which would drive down the fees, and yet USCIS has not substantially adjusted to taking that into account.
So, Cris, how is Congress responding to this request for funding? I note, just as we're taping this on July 8th, news has dropped that there might be a bipartisan funding bill forthcoming. But why has this been controversial?
So I think, the reason that there's been a lot of controversy around this is that some Democrats and certainly some on the immigration advocacy side have been very reticent to provide this administration and DHS with any additional funding that they believe DHS and the administration might try to move over for enforcement purposes or move over for continuing to fund President Trump's border wall. And where you're seeing things right now, where the Democrats are going, and we'll talk about this a little bit later in this episode about DHS funding, is that they really want to be able to limit the capacity of the administration to have funds to carry out its enforcement priorities. So this fits in line with that thinking that there is, that they want, or at least we're thinking of trying to establish guardrails against this funding being used for purposes other than what Congress had designated for. I think that the news about a new potential bipartisan deal is pretty important and actually pretty significant, and shows that that Congress may be looking at this from a perspective of, let's just simply provide them with funding, let's address the pain, and then maybe we can consider other questions around enforcement later down the road. But certainly I think that that's where things have been coming from, at least on the Democratic and immigration advocacy side, that there's been a lot of concern that these funds may be used for purposes that they don't agree with, and be able to use it towards purposes that they feel may be harming immigrants, whether they're in the United States or they're arriving at the southwest border.
You mentioned immigration advocates. What's been the broader public reaction to this news? My sense is that this story isn't getting a lot of attention compared with the impact that it would have.
Yeah, this is interesting because we were just talking about this new ICE policy in the last segment, and I think a lot of it has to deal with the fact that the American public really doesn't interact with the immigration system that often. I mean, we've done polling here at BPC that kind of shows this, that people really aren't that familiar with the immigration system. And if you think about it, most individuals who interact with the immigration system are either employers who are sponsoring foreign workers to work here, or U.S. citizens who may be sponsoring family members. So for instance, U.S. citizens who are sponsoring their non-citizen spouses to come here on a green card. Those are the actors that primarily interact with the immigration system, but the rest of the American population doesn't really interact with the system, doesn't really know how it works. And so when you start talking about this, I think people kind of scratch their heads and they're not putting two and two together. If it were the case that the IRS all of a sudden had a shortfall and couldn't start processing tax refunds, I'm certain a lot more people would start to complain and get concerned because a lot more people interact with the tax system. And so that's, I think, one reason. And so when you're looking at this ICE policy as a point of contrast, I think more individuals interact with the higher education system. Either they went to college, they send their kids to college, they work at colleges, they root for college teams. I mean, there's that sense of like an understanding, at least, of how higher education works in this country. And so as a result, when you start talking about this ICE policy, people can at least conceptually think about the impact that having an only online education might force somebody to go back to their country. So I think that's the reason why you're seeing sort of this discrepancy in reaction to these two developments. That I think the familiarity that the American public has with the immigration system, I think, can limit their capacity to really react to major developments like this, where an agency, for all intents and purposes, can't fulfill its mission. So I think that that's really the key point there.
Yeah, I think Cris is absolutely right. There's a familiarity, at least from the immigration side on this. I also would be remiss if I didn't point out that the public, for the most part, doesn't have a whole lot of attention for stories that impact just the federal workforce. There are big stories in Washington, D.C., where, so much of the population is depending on the running of the federal government. Anytime we have a government shutdown, it's a much bigger story inside D.C. than outside. So I think there's a little bit of that, too. But until the impact of this is felt, if USCIS lays off 70% of its workforce. This isn't all people in DC. USCIS employs people in Nebraska, in Vermont, in California, in Texas, in major cities across the country. That will have impact on those communities as well, where that workforce is now going to be furloughed and will not be contributing to economic activity in those places. So it may sound like a wonky, bureaucratic government story, but it's not. And I think that's the problem, is that people need to kind of understand that the second and third tier effects of this are beyond just a government agency and whether or not it can do its job.
All right, after the break, walls, both physical and virtual. Last month, the federal appeals court in the Ninth Circuit ruled that the Trump administration's efforts to use $2.5 billion in military funds to build a border wall was an illegal overreach of executive authority. That ruling came as House Democrats unveiled a new DHS appropriations bill that restricts the administration's ability to make such a move in the future. But the administration also issued a contract to build a so-called virtual wall to detect the movement of people and vehicles across the border, and that's something that Democrats have supported in the past. So, Theresa, let's back up and talk about this court ruling. What did the court say, and will it have any impact on wall construction happening right now?
So this was a case that was filed in California by the Sierra Club and the Southern Border Communities Coalition against President Trump, Department of Homeland Security, Department of Defense, and Treasury Department. And as you said, the case revolved around whether or not the president and those agencies had the authority to take money under the president's executive emergency declaration for building the wall from the Department of Defense and give it to DHS for this purpose when Congress had not authorized it to do so. The lower court in the Northern District of California had ruled against the administration. The administration took that case to appeal at the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court stayed that injunction while the case was going through the lower court. This is now the Ninth Circuit decision reaffirming that lower court decision. Interestingly enough, this case, at least in this decision, revolves around constitutional issues. The court ruled by a 2-to-1 majority that the executive branch violated the appropriations clause of the Constitution by exceeding its delegated spending authority in express violation of prohibitions that were put by Congress in the National Defense Appropriation Act. So Congress had explicitly said, you will not do this. The executive branch said, we think we have authority under this other section of law to do it. And the court is saying no. Now, what this means, however, is a little bit unclear because that Supreme Court stay is still in effect for the moment. We imagine that Department of Justice is going to appeal this again to the Supreme Court, but the Supreme Court is ending its term this week, so it's unclear if any appeal will be heard anytime soon. In the meantime, the wall's being built.
Cris, how exactly are House Democrats looking to constrain the administration on using military funds for border walls in the future?
Well, at least in terms of the DHS appropriations, they've incorporated some restrictions on wall funding. Specifically, the DHS appropriations bill that House Democrats revealed basically said that Treasury funds from the Department of Treasury Forfeiture Fund cannot be used for the border wall. The border wall cannot be constructed in certain specific sectors. And there is a section on there that explicitly states, notwithstanding any provision of law, no federal funds may be used for the construction of physical barriers along the southern land border of the United States during fiscal year 2021. So that's at least within DHS funding. There's obviously discussions about what may be happening with the National Defense Authorization Act and whether or not there might be restrictions there that can seek to limit the capacity of the administration to be able to use Department of Defense funding for wall funding. So that's going to be the other thing to be able to track once that bill hits, is whether or not there's also guardrails that are going to be incorporated into that bill to prevent the administration from doing what it did that led to this lawsuit. So House Democrats, at least, are definitely being very active on this. But the open question is always is where the Senate is on this, and whether or not the Senate will largely agree to these restrictions. And obviously, that's controlled by Republicans. So it's a question of where the Senate will find some consensus on this issue, if they even agree this at all, and then how the House and the Senate will try to at least align the bills during during discussions for the final passage, and to go from there. So that's really the open question, is really where the Senate's where they're gonna fall on this issue.
And Theresa, as I understand it, House Democrats are also looking to potentially bar the administration from backfilling the repurposed military funds as well. How might that work, and what's the thinking behind that?
Well, as I understand it, the thinking is that if Congress were to basically give DOD back the funds that the administration took from them to build the wall, it would be ratifying what the administration did. And so they are saying, well, we're not going to allow you to backfill that. You're going to feel the pain from the decision that you made. The problem that I see with that is that the Department of Defense then gets taxed twice for this. And, the projects that they had wanted to do, a lot of which were military construction for housing, for schools, for, facilities for military and families on military bases here and around the world, don't get done. And those are things that are of, importance to our military and their military families. So I think, and for an administration that, frankly, I think it has shown, at least the Ninth Circuit ruled, doesn't care about the congressional authorizations and restrictions, you wonder who this is hurting if they do prevent that from being backfilled. And so it really raises a bigger question. As I mentioned, the Ninth Circuit decision is based on a constitutional separation of powers question. Congress has the power of the purse. Congress is the one that is authorized and appropriates money to the executive branch to carry out the responsibilities it gives it under statute. If the administration is ignoring that, the question becomes, what is the remedy? Even if this Ninth Circuit decision stays in effect, that money's already been spent. The $2.5 billion has been spent mostly on border wall in Arizona. President Trump was just out in Arizona to celebrate the 200th mile of replacement or new wall. That money is not coming back to the government. So what's the remedy here? This, to me, is the biggest issue with all of this, is that this is about an administration that is not really caring about the constitutional authorities granted to it and to Congress. And that is a significant problem because Congress could put whatever restrictions it wants. And I think that's part of the reasons Democrats are concerned, is that if you have an administration that is just willing to ignore that, what's next? What do you do? And I think that's a huge question.
So I want to wrap this up by coming back to this question of a virtual wall. Theresa, how does this concept differ from its physical counterpart other than the obvious? And might this new move by the administration to put its weight behind a virtual wall undermine what has been in the past bipartisan support for the concept?
So this idea of a quote-unquote virtual wall actually goes back to the George W. Bush administration. When they first started this idea of maybe we can put up sufficient surveillance equipment and other sensors and detectors so that we can know when people are crossing the border, and that would give us enough opportunity and direct our resources to go interdict people who are crossing illegally or bringing drugs or whatever else across illegally. And so starting in the Bush administration, they started contracts to build this quote unquote virtual wall. It started with surveillance equipment, fixed towers, the idea of aerial surveillance and drones, as well as ground sensors. It continued into the Obama administration. There were a lot of problems with it. Frankly, the technology never worked as promised. There were billions of dollars spent on it, and Janet Napolitano, when she was Secretary of DHS, ended up canceling this program after spending somewhere close to $10 billion on it. Now, the technology seems to have caught up. And the Trump administration recently signed a 5-year contract with a company called Anduril, run by the former CEO of Oculus Tech, a man named Palmer Luckey, who is a known Trump supporter, to build 200 mobile integrated surveillance towers. And the big technological leap forward, if you will, on this is the artificial intelligence engine behind it that allows these systems to automatically detect whether an incursion in an area is a person, a vehicle, or just some natural occurrence like an animal wandering through, which is a big issue in some of these very remote areas of the border. The other thing is that these are mobile. They are not fixed towers or facilities, so their environmental impact is not as great. It might be easier for example, the Native American tribes along the border to allow their placement in some of the remote areas in their territory, or for folks that are concerned about environmental impact along natural parks and reserves along the border as well. Because of that lower footprint, because of the interest in using technology instead of physical barriers, this has been an area that Democrats and Republicans in the past have been very supportive of. But I do think that the way this administration has talked about enforcement of the border and the response that Democrats have had to the way this administration has pushed forward on these things, it's a question whether or not they're going to continue to support even this kind of border enforcement technology in the future. BPC has supported this in the past, and we do think that technology is important to get awareness and to know what's happening and to deal with incursions along the border. It has the capacity to be much more cost efficient than walls, and particularly in very remote and environmentally sensitive areas of the border. So we do think it is something that's worth pursuing. The history here is not great on the contracting, but this seems to be a step forward that at least at the beginning looks like it could be a successful alternative.
All right, that's a good place to leave it for today. Theresa, Cris, thanks so much for joining me. And thanks to you for listening. We'll be back in 2 weeks. Before we go, a quick reminder to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Stitcher, Spotify, or your favorite podcast platform. You can also find more information on all the issues we discuss here on the show at bipartisanpolicy.org/immigration. This Week in Immigration was created by Theresa Cardinal Brown and myself. The executive producer of This Week in Immigration is Theresa Cardinal Brown. This week's episode was written by Ramón and myself. Our producers are Ramón and Yafat Tawahada, and our editor is Yafat Tawahada. And the executive producer of BPC Podcasts is Ashley Swearingen. I'm Jordan LaPier. Join us again next time on This Week in Immigration.